Welcome, David. Nice to have you
Hello.
on the What podcast.
Hello, Natalie. Thank you for inviting me. Much appreciated.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm gonna just ask you to introduce yourself to get us started, and then we'll get into a really great conversation.
Okay. Well, I'm English born,
Yes.
emigrated to Canada in 1993 with my wife.
Hmm.
We set up our home and we've been here obviously over 30 years now. And we have four children, live in
Wow.
Ottawa. And for a bulk of the time that I've been in Canada, I've been an executive. I've been very fortunate to have had global positions. So I've traveled around the world with in various positions, various companies. And about 5 years ago, I went to the dark side of the world and became a consultant. And I became a coach through, I would say, kind of serendipity. And I in that time, I've in the last 10 years anyway, I've written a couple of books, and I've one of my books has been used by the Ottawa University for their EMBA program
Oh,
on
wonderful.
leadership. And now I've just launched another book, and I'm very excited about the content. It's about leadership onboarding,
Mm-hmm.
and coaching is a very integral part to that program. And so when I went through the program with your own company, it added some technicalities, should I say, to my coaching capabilities. And that's how I got to know you, and that's why I'm here today.
Amazing. So I kind of feel like it's serendipitous that we ended up here together on this podcast. And I know that you mentioned earlier that before we started that your books have a little bit of that, looking back on how things sort of happen. So I'm just really excited to dig into a lot of these things, and the timing seems very appropriate since you just launched your second book. Um, and also just recognizing that you've had a pretty incredible career, it sounds like. So much to talk about. What I do kind of want to touch on first is this, you talked about coaching being serendipitous. Do you want to say more about that?
Yes, I think as with, I would suspect many coaches, many people who want to be coaches, there is a certain altruism to it.
Mm.
And throughout my career, I would say I've been a coach. So I've been very privileged to work with some very impressive leaders. And leaders, you don't manage, you work with them.
Mm.
And I learned that early on in my executive career that it wasn't my job to manage them, it was my job to be a coach. And so I was coaching through default for many years. And then when I left the organization that I'd been with for nearly 20 years, I thought I'd write about it. And so my first book, which was called Seven Steps to the Boardroom, introduced a program that was kind of a coaching program without deliberately being so. And it outlaid steps that one needs to take in order to develop through the career. So it was more, I would say, advisory than coaching
Mm.
as a book, but it led to many consulting agreements or consulting engagements for me. And then I found myself being, again, more of a coach. And then more recently, I've been onboarding leaders into their new role. So over the first 3 months, and I created a program for that. And then I thought, well, let's write about it and get that
Mhm.
out as well. So there's a lot of writing involved. I enjoy writing, but it's all based on experience, which really going back, many years has been my career. It's been coaching, even though it's in the form of an executive.
Well, I really like the distinction you make between, I think you said working with them as opposed to, I guess, trying to tell them what to do, right? um, and so, what do you think coaching offers that a more directive style doesn't?
That's a very broad, very important question. And I would say in the business world, not necessarily in the coaching world, but in the business world, as a manager, I was more directing. Even as I would say a leader, there was a lot of directing. And that's not to say that I was a taskmaster or anything like that, but there's a strategy that needs to be implemented. And as a manager or even as a leader, my objective is to make sure people understand what that strategy is, how to execute, and support them in the execution. As an executive who had leaders reporting to me, it took me about a year to understand this, Natalie. I worked with some pretty big companies that were subsidiaries of the main company that I worked with. All of them had very extreme experienced presidents and managing directors who now reported to me. And for the first year, I was kind of managing them because that was my experience. And I realized that, hold on a minute, as a manager myself, and certainly when I was the president of a company, I didn't take too well to being managed. And so it took me a while to understand this. But once I got it, and I started working with these leaders, it very much became a coaching relationship. And I was there to support them. And I was there to help them see what they needed to do, and sometimes give them advice or guidance based on my experience. But it was mostly helping them see what they were doing and giving them a sounding board to test their theories, their thought experiments on somebody that understood what they were talking about and could give them some questions that might lead them in a different path, or the same path, but maybe a deeper perspective. So coaching for me, even though I didn't call it that, coaching for me was it was kind of a fork in the road between management and leadership, and working with other people, helping them to be better at what they do, rather than, not necessarily, it sounds a bit bold when you say telling people what to do, but being prescriptive. Coaching is much, for me, it was much more about bringing the best out of people. And to me, that was always been my personal mission, is to help others grow, help them achieve their potential. And I think, again, as the coaching fraternity would say, most coaches have that DNA that they want to help people to grow. And I'll say here, I love doing that. It's a wonderful feeling when you see somebody get it and they move forward. And maybe they struggle when they move forward, but they've moved forward, and I think that's progress.
So it's that co-creation, it sounds like, that partnership of equals that we talk about in coaching. And so you've written these books, and what do you think, well, what was it that you think Ottawa University saw in your book to accept it into the program? That's such a great achievement.
Yes, and I co-authored that with a professor who I worked with in my own company. So my own company before, well, not mine, the company I worked with was a training company, and we had many PhDs that delivered the content. And I co-authored the work with this doctor. It was a very broad work. It was quite literally from step one, which is understanding who you are, all the way through to step 7, which is leading in an executive capacity, and all the steps in between. So it's a really broad mandate, and parts of it were about leadership and parts of it about executive. And because my co-author was a professor, she was asked by the University of Ottawa if she would use the program that we had created, the Career Acceleration Program, if she would embed that into their leadership program. And so she taught the courses, and then I was a guest speaker. And they ran it for a few years, and it was very exciting for us. It was nice to think that the work that we put together had not just an interest for readers, but also had a practical application to these students. I mentor MBA students, and I think it's wonderful to see people, again, it's kind of coaching, but it's it's a slightly different tack, but it's wonderful when a person is introduced to an idea that to me might be old, but to them it's new, and it takes them off in a different thought direction. So that's why the Telfer School of Management, I think it's called, is wanted to use the first book in their program. And it's interesting as well, Natalie, you and I were saying before we got on this call about serendipity and looking back on our career. When I left school at a very young age, I had no idea that I'd do what I did. And yet, when I look back on it, it seems quite obvious. It was quite an obvious path. And there are certain pieces in my career and in my life that I look at, and when I look back on it, say, of course that happened. And it was preparing me for the next step, which of course happened. And so what I like to share with people, if I can, is what are your milestones? What have you already done? And what's it saying that you could or should be doing next, as opposed to going off blind alleys and cul-de-sacs and then coming back and finding out. So to me, that's quite the process of life, and the process of the career doesn't have to be rigid like that sounds process, but when you look back on it, it's like, of course that happened. And of course you and I are talking today because it was supposed to be.
Yeah, there's a great coaching tool called, I think it's called Lifespan. And you look back and you look at the pivotal moments of your life, when you change direction, when an opportunity came, and looking at like, what did you learn about yourself, and what do you see or notice looking back now, which, is often more clear than in the moments you're making those decisions, right? That clarity, like for me too, like I look back at my first introduction to coaching and I was so young and I didn't know where it would lead. But one thing I know for sure is that it shaped my mindset for what to pay attention to, where my energy would go, where my focus would go, what I could contribute, what I could believe I could contribute as well, like that growth mindset. So, which, to me, coaching and growth mindset are pretty much intertwined. What would you say, because I've heard you kind of mention coaching and mentoring interchangeably, and I wonder, what do you believe is the difference between coaching and mentoring?
They're very, very closely aligned, except I would say coaching and mentoring, and I would add in facilitation and advising. So we've got kind of four branches of, we could say, knowledge transfer or knowledge awareness. Between mentoring and coaching, typically when I've been assigned as a mentor, it's because I have something that the mentee would like to have through experience or through knowledge, gathered knowledge. But there's something I have that the mentee looks at and says, I'd like to chat with this person because I think I can learn something from them. Whereas coaching, it doesn't really matter what my experience has been. My aim as a coach is to help you bring your own experiences out. And so I think there's a subtle distinction, but I think it's, in fact, I would say that when I took your course at Coach Academy, it made it very clear to me that coaching is much more about bringing out of the minds of the people that we're working with than it is advising. And as a leader, as a manager throughout my career, there's a natural default for me to tell people what to do, to advise them. And so coaching, sometimes you have to bite your lip. That's not an easy thing to do. It's a skill set. So that's my answer. The difference between mentoring and coaching, while they're very similar, with a very similar objective, is to move forward with our thoughts and our experiences. Mentorship is more, they're looking for something from me. Coaching is more, I'm actually looking something from you.
Yeah, I think Nancy Klein says it best, you know, the mind that holds the problem holds the solution. And I think, you know, that we as coaches are there to evoke awareness of, you know, solutions that are already known to
Yes.
the client, right?
Yes.
And maybe subconsciously, and that's where the evoking comes in. But I really, yeah, I appreciate that distinction because it's one that not many people know, right? And I think that you said coming into the program, it clarified it for you. And so many people, when they start our programs, are very surprised at the difference between coaching and mentoring and
Yes.
advising and consulting, and those helping professions, or you know, transfer of knowledge is also a good way of putting it. And so
You know,
when you, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, this is an age-old saying, when the pupil's ready, the teacher will appear. What I've discovered in my life, I'm an avid reader. And when I look back on the books that I've read, and sometimes even while I'm reading a book, I recognize that I've been drawn to that book because it articulates what I already know in a
Mm,
way that I couldn't articulate it. And so I'll read a book, whatever the subject, whether it's science, philosophy, psychology, whatever it is, I'll read a book, and the ones that I resonate with are those that are articulating what I already know. And I think that's true of coaching, is when you have the right connection, the coach and the coachee, if that's the right word, um, when you connect, there's a resonance that I can say things to you that you already know, but it just sparks something within you and you can take it further. And so
mm,
that's, I think, that's a connection, and it happens very frequently. It's not an unusual thing. I think that particularly a good coach can create that connection by understanding who the person is that they're speaking with, what they're looking to do. If you get these fundamentals up front, then a good coach can then guide the thought process and what we're going to discuss without actually saying we need to discuss this today. It's almost magic, I would say. And so in the same way that I've always found that the next book that I read is almost obvious because I'm looking for it, even though I don't know it
mm-hmm,
consciously. It's the
mm-hmm.
same thing when you're coaching, is what you said to me now. Of course, you said that to me because I was looking for it.
Yeah, that brings me to, like, you know, the reticular activating system and how we're really paying attention to what's within our field of awareness, right? Our belief systems. So and it's such an interesting opportunity to be coached, to bring that clarity to
Yes,
someone, to start to articulate what it is that they want. And through the dialogue of coaching, that's where that clarity happens, right? That's why that partnership of equals is so important.
yes.
Don't think we can do it on our own if we're trying to, you know, evoke awareness of the things that we're not even aware of, right? We don't know what we don't know. So that coach relationship, that reflection is the biggest opportunity for me in coaching.
You use the word, you've used it a few times now, awareness. I would suggest that the master skill of success, whether it's career or in family life, social, community, is awareness. I
Mm,
think that many people go through life with the blinkers on,
yeah.
and blinkers, actually what we need is awareness within rather than awareness without. But I took a course when I was about 25 years old, and it changed my mind because for the first time I became aware of what I was doing and why I was doing it. And so I then made it a habit to continually ask myself why about what I
Mm,
was doing. And I believe that that had a significant influence in my career, the trajectory of my career, but also my home life. Because of that, we traveled around the world, we emigrated, we settled here in Canada. And I think for me, there are many key points, but that one, that course I took is with Brian Tracy. It was called The Psychology of Success, no, Psychology of Achievement.
mm,
And after I took that, it opened my mind to being aware of what I do and why I do it. And I think if we can help people become more aware of their circumstances, the answers to many of their questions will come to them as well. So awareness is a key word.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a researcher, I'm going to probably mess up her name. Her name is Tasha Ehrlich, I believe. She speaks about awareness and how, there's very few of us, well, a lot of us think we're aware, and we're actually not. Only 10% of us are actually very self-aware. Um, and she actually challenges you or us in our thinking, even in personal self-reflection, to ask the question, what, not why. And so I wonder what, Brian Tracy would say about that now today, because it's this really important shift between defensive or justification versus open exploration. Like, what do I want this for? What is on the other side of this? Or what am I learning from this experience? Turning those why questions into what.
Yes.
It's a really fascinating research, actually. And the other thing that you said was about knowing who you are, something like that. And I think that that
Yes.
was the first step in your leadership
Yes.
process, right? And I really love that you start there. So tell me about like what that means to you.
Again, a very broad subject, but I classified it as human middleware. So, comparing
Middle.
it to the technology industry, you've got your applications that you work with and you've got your hard drive that it rests on. But in between, what we don't see is middleware. And this is the
Mm,
thing that connects your biology, if you like, to your actions. And this is, you could say the how or the what, but it's also the why. Why do I
mm,
do things the way that I do? And this is very much rooted in the conditioning that we have had from childhood through to early adulthood. And so for me, whether you're 21 or 51, being aware of your human middleware, spelled W-A-R-E, human
right.
middleware,
Yeah.
being aware of your human middleware can help you understand why you have, for example, some of your unconscious biases that may lead you down certain paths that may not actually be good for you. Some of the habits that you have, some of the values that you have may not actually be yours. You've just inherited them. And so I think the very first step in progress is to understand, this is just a small slither of it, but to understand, who am I? Why do I do the things that I do? Do I actually agree with the things that I do? Or should I amend them? And then from that platform, it's kind of like the basic values system. If you are then, once you agree to your values, if you are then consistent with your values, I believe that you have a much smoother ride, in whatever it is that you want to do. So that first step of knowing yourself, and as I said, I called it human middleware. This is an aspect that it's never too late to do it. And I always say, I've worked with leaders who are in their 20s and they've been brilliant. And I've worked with leaders, very senior leaders in their 50s who are absolute nightmare. Very obnoxious. And a main reason why they're that way is because they don't really understand what their true values are. So I think it's an important starting point.
Mm. Well, we could talk forever on values. Yeah, for sure. And so tell me about this new book. What was the driver for publishing this new book?
Yeah, so the driver, I guess the objective driver is having gone to the dark side of the world in consulting, and I was doing various projects. A company reached out to me and asked me if I would create a program
Hmm.
to help them onboard their leaders. And I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting because I've never really thought about that, even though I had onboarded numerous leaders in my career. I'd never really seriously considered the process that's required. And so, first of all, I considered, what's the objective?
Mm.
And for me, the objective of an incoming leader is to learn as much about their business, the environment, the subjective elements of a business, in order to put them in again, build a platform on
Mm.
which they could perform. So that's the goal. And so I put together a program, and I look back into my career and I thought, well, I never did this, not in a structured manner, but pieces of it I did. And I would say that process was a strong suit for me. And yet I'd never done it. So I created this program and I reached out to hundreds of leaders and businesses.
Okay.
And I asked them what they did and how they did it. And it was absolutely incredible how um, shallow the onboarding process is
Hmm.
across all sorts of industries. And when I described the program that I had created, it was like night and day. And so now I cottoned on to something. So the objective was, can you build me a program? The subjective for me was, as a person who is passionate about seeing leaders excel, I realized that the onboarding period of about 3 to 5 months is probably the most concentrated leadership growth period in anybody's career. And it can happen a number of times, of course, but in that period, when you join a new firm or you take on a new role, you're in learning mode like you aren't at any other time in your career. And so what I wanted to do is then from my own subjective standpoint is I wanted to build a program that was world class, that would help people not only stay in the job, because there's a really sad and dramatic high turnover of leaderships in new roles. So I wanted to reduce that turnover. But most importantly, I wanted people who take on a new role, who are very excited about it, to fulfill that excitement. Many people after 3 or 4 months in the job are frustrated because they don't really understand the culture, or they don't really understand why companies do the things the way they do. And yet they're there to learn about this. And so I built this program and I've delivered it myself dozens of times. The program's run hundreds of times. And it's so satisfying and so all inclusive when we're talking. I love talking about business, and you have to touch on every aspect of a business if you're really going to get a good understanding for it. So,
Mm.
having done all that, I thought, you know what, I need to write about this. So, I've written the book, I've created a self-administered leadership onboarding program, so
Mm.
anybody can download it for free. Because my
Nice.
goal is for people to be able to uh, achieve their potential at work, but also for the hiring firm to make sure that they don't waste their money, and that they can actually grow with this new leader. So that was the purpose. That was how I got into it, and I'm kind of excited for it to expand to the world.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I did work with a company, a placement agency, with an international placement agency. And when I was speaking to like the heads of the multinationals in my role, I was head of global communications, and I would say to them, what's keeping you up at night?
Hmm.
And they would say it's well, often in those situations it was the cultural aspects, because the multicultures that come together, because they're attracting talent worldwide to come and work in Africa, Asia,
Yes.
on the mines and heavy industry, and then of course transfer of knowledge and all that. But one of the things that kept coming up was this onboarding piece, and the owner of the company that I was working with looked at me and said, like, we need to have some kind of way to onboard this new talent into the organizations, but most importantly into the cultures that they're going into, because they were expats and they were coming from all over the world.
Yes.
And one of the things we were thinking of is every onboarding should have a coach,
Yes.
somebody who can help them and feel supported in that process and integrate, and also help them tap into resources that could help them feel more significant, or at least answer those subjective questions that you were talking about. And we never really pursued it, but we did speak with a multicultural expert or two, actually two or three. It was super interesting to think about like developing ways. And like you in your research, we understood that there was no real process in place. It was
Yes.
kind of intuitive, but leaving out so much, like even the families that were traveling with
Yes.
these talents,
Absolutely.
they were left out on their own and nobody was taking care of the families. And you know, the cost of hiring is huge when you lose people, especially if you're hiring a recruitment agency, all the time invested in training and then you lose them 3 months into the process, you've just lost a huge amount of money. I mean, I remember we quantified it at the time. I can't remember what it was, but the cost of hiring is humongous. And I'm surprised that, you know, I feel like coaching is a huge opportunity when it comes to helping people retain talent, helping the companies retain talent, but not just
Yeah.
retain, like you said, it's that one of the most important growth periods of your life as a leader, being onboarded into a new company. You're learning so much about yourself and about the environment, and you're being challenged to take on new tasks, right? You're always in that discomfort zone of growth.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. So did you weave in a coach into your process?
Oh yeah. Oh yes, absolutely. So I've
Okay.
been coached. So this is where I refer back to the comment about the difference between coaching, advising, and facilitating.
Mm,
So the program that I deliver incorporates all three.
mm,
So it's facilitation because there is a structured program. So today we're going to talk about the business strategy, or today we're going to talk about influencing skills. So
mhm.
there's a specific item. It's not like I say to the incoming leader, what do you want to talk about today? As I would do in coaching. So
Right.
I would say, okay, today we're going to talk about the key objectives of the company. So that's the facilitation part, but then there's the um, coaching part with they will tell me what the objectives are, and I will probe to find out how much they know about these objectives, how do they execute on these objectives. So that's more the coaching side. But then
Mhm.
there's also advising. And so, you know, if a person says, I'm doing this, and I say, well, have you considered this, that, or the other? And I might do that more times than if I'm purely coaching, because I want to make sure that they are considering all the elements. So it's absolutely a coaching program. And I think one of the reasons why many companies don't have a structured onboarding program is because the facilitation of that onboarding is either tacked on to the hiring manager who just happens to be the sales manager or whatever. And so they don't know what needs to be done. And frankly, they don't have the time. Or it's passed over to a person perhaps in the HR department who again doesn't have a program, but they know that these things should be discussed, but there's no real methodology to it. And so it is intuitive, but because of busy lives, we just don't do it. And so having a third party facilitator or a coach, you can then make sure that this happens at this time. And then we're not going to talk about strategy until 6 or 8 weeks in, because you won't know enough about the company to talk about strategy. Whereas if I tell you what the strategy is on day two and leave you to it and expect, okay, he knows the strategy now, it just doesn't work that way. So the timing, the structure, and the facilitation of it to keep the mindfulness of what you're doing, all of that comes into the overall program. It was interesting as well. You mentioned family of an incoming leader.
Mm,
And personally, I traveled a lot in my business. And
mhm.
at the time, I had four very young children. And so my wife, who did all the heavy lifting, looked after four children while I was away in Europe for a few weeks or whatever. Uh, that cannot be underestimated in my career when I can take on a new role. What impact will it have on my family? And it's almost never discussed. And right now, there's a massive trend towards working from home. And so, how do I, who have never even met half the people that I work with, and maybe I've not even been into the office, How do I know who this company is? What are the prevailing values of this company when all I get to see them is on a little a screen once a day or whatever? How do you integrate those people, especially if they're a leader? If you've got 3,000 employees under you,
Mm,
how do you work that from a screen? So all of these challenges, and there'll be more challenges as we go, as AI incorporates into our work. How do I use technology, culture, distances? How do I thread that into integrating into a new role, which in itself is a big thing? Oh, and then by the way, you throw in a dynamic condition. So I'm coaching a person that's going into a job that's just downsized.
mm.
How do you handle that? I mean, it's quite complicated sometimes.
Yeah, no, I feel like there's oh, it's such a good topic though. Like it's such a good place to focus your energy. And I appreciate what you said about that third party perspective, because that was what we had found too, was that it couldn't be somebody in the organization. And we also, in our particular position, knew that we had to have somebody who would in the country, but had lived outside of the country for at least 5 years to be able to understand the perspective of integration into a culture, right? You couldn't have somebody who had never left their country talk about how to integrate into a culture. So there were little nuances that came up that it deserves its own role.
Yes,
And that, and it's about not just the candidate, but the care of the family and everything that comes with it. Like we had even organized for a partners like group coaching, where the partner who was left out at home taking care of the kids or whatever
yes,
was able to come into a group with other partners who were also left behind,
yes,
talk
yes.
about what it was like they were going through, right? What they were feeling and the challenges and the opportunities, I guess.
And you
So
throw in the pressure of
yeah,
traveling
yeah.
on a relationship. I mean, that's another complete topic of coaching that you can do. But uh, I mentioned earlier, so I emigrated from the UK. So I'm a Brit living in Canada as the executive of an American firm who had a business. We had subsidiaries in multiple continents and did
Mm,
business in over 50 countries. And
wow.
so, I spent as much time in Paris as I did in London, as I did in New York, as I do here in Ottawa. So the culture, it was beautiful to actually experience the culture, the diversity.
Mm,
But you know what? There's something that we all have in common. All human beings want to achieve, they want to be productive, whether they live in Tokyo or whether they live in Washington, D.C. We might do it in a different way, we might say it in a different way, but at the core of it, the culture, there's something very familiar about us all. But having that experience and then being able to share, because it can hit you like a bus if you're not prepared for it, and family and at work. So it's important work that we do.
yeah, I would call that, and I think that's super interesting to find the common thread among cultures. And I think I would call that progress. Like we
Yes,
all have an investment in progress. Nobody wants to stand still, I guess.
yeah.
And can you stand still? That would be another philosophical debate.
Well,
Yeah.
this is philosophical, but I would say we are like flowers, and
Mm,
when we're growing, and when a flower stops growing, it means they're dying. It's not like you've stood still.
yeah.
And so I think that we have an innate desire to move forward. And that's not based on greed, it's not based on power. I think it's just based on our natural human instinct is to
Hmm.
move forward,
Hmm.
to experience. And if we can tap into what is it that you want to experience, then we can really help people move forward with happiness, or with intent. I think
Yeah.
that's the goal.
Oh, absolutely. Progress can be, it's not necessarily materialistic. It's that personal growth that we talk about, or like
Yes.
development of ourselves. The other thing that came to mind was as you were talking, much like an athlete who is performing at a certain level their entire lives leaves, let's say, their sport and feels that void. It's the same for leaders, right? Leaders who have been in a company at the head of, first of all, progressing their career, climbing the corporate ladder,
Yes.
and then they reach that and then retirement comes. There's an opportunity for coaching at that transition because people have that, like, okay, I want to still progress, but now what? And that void kind of sets in. And what you said, is when we stop growing, we stop living
Yes.
almost, right?
Yes.
And there's studies that show that when people retire and they don't find something to continue to invest in, they die. Like
Yes.
they literally die
Yes.
because they're empty. And so, yeah, I'm just thinking about that now as you're talking. Like this is so
There's
many opportunities.
broadly speaking, there are various categories of life that we go through. So there's the discovery
Yeah.
phase,
Yeah.
then there's the warrior phase, and I think the warrior phase is between probably 25 and 50 is where you're out to conquer the world. But
Yeah.
then when you get a little bit older, like I am, obviously, when you get a little bit older, you realize that you don't have to conquer the world. You can work with the world, and actually seeing other people conquer their world is more appealing, and that we might call the ambassador stage. So
Oh, I
we
love
go
it.
from this formative period to the warrior stage to the ambassador. An ambassador is where the leaders, where really good leaders reside. Their
Mm,
goal is to help others. They want to lift others. And you can't help when you kind of, the rising, looking at your picture behind you there, the rising tide lifts all boats. And you are one of those boats. So when you're helping other people to rise above themselves, you are rising above themselves yourself as well. So it's
mm.
poetic there.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. I actually just noticed because your head moved. I noticed that you have your Canada coach. That's so good to see on your shelf.
Of course, I had to put it there
Yeah.
because
Yeah. That's great.
and I
And
will say,
pardon?
there was something about the coaching program that I wanted to share with
Mhm.
you. When I was when I first came to Canada, I joined Toastmasters.
Mm,
And at the time, I felt I'd been a reasonably successful salesperson in the UK for probably about 7 or 8 years. And so when I came to Canada and I was trying to find my way, and I joined Toastmasters mostly to meet people
mhm.
because I thought I knew everything there was to know about public speaking and very confident. I learned a lot. I ended up staying there for a couple of years, did some designations with them, did some speech contests with them. I learned so much about the technical side of public speaking that
Mm,
I wasn't expecting. I would say it was the same when I went through the program, the coaching program. And I'll be frank here, I'd been coaching my program. I'd already coached hundreds of hours before I went into the course. And I thought I'd do it just to get the certification so I can put it on my resume. When I send out a proposal, it says, yeah, I'm a qualified coach. But so I did it for that reason. I learned so much about the technical side of coaching. And of course, I met some wonderful people in the cohort, and
mm,
I gained so much more than I was expecting when I went into it. So I point to the certification, and while it's it could be a little logo on the bottom of one of my pages or whatever, what it actually means to me is what I learned and the relationships that I built through the program, which is worth the entry fee alone, let alone maybe the reason why you did it to start with. The reason why I did it is just to get a logo.
yeah, I'm happy to hear you say that because I think, one of my big ambitions is to bring a legitimacy to coaching that isn't
Yes.
currently necessarily there because the profession is inundated with people who are not certified. They've
Yes.
never had a day of training. They call themselves coaches. And also, companies are to blame too because they hire people who are not trained as coaches, right? They
Mhm.
hire people who don't have credentials as coaches, and I think it's doing the profession a disservice to just say, oh, you call yourself a coach, you must be a coach.
Mhm.
It's like there's no other, profession I feel that is at the level of where we are at in terms of helping people that doesn't have credentialing behind it.
You
And
know,
I, yeah.
so I felt the same way in my first career, which is in sales. And what it seemed to me, and maybe it was true for me, you either got a degree in and you became a professional, like a doctor or a dentist or an accountant or some, or you became a salesperson because you didn't get a profession. And it used to rankle me like the coaching is for you, because as a salesperson, there is so much to learn, and you can, well, I don't need to explain the difference between a good and a bad salesperson, but in the same way as coaching, you can have a good and a bad coach.
Oh, even if
I
they're
think
credentialed, you can have a good and a bad coach.
Yeah,
Yeah, for
true.
sure.
It's true. But at least
Mhm.
if for in sales, I would say I have a degree, I have a master's in sales, but there isn't one. Um, at least now in coaching, because of the work of people like yourself, and I understand the ICF, and I understand there are a lot of good coaching training companies out there. Because of the work of those people, at least we can say we now have a fundamental understanding of what coaching is, and there are certain, should we say, values that we need to apply to how we coach, as opposed to, as you say, just hanging a shingle up and saying, I'm a coach. And it's a bit of a hit and miss whether this is a genuine person or not. Just because you've had a bit of experience in life doesn't mean that you're a coach.
Well, no, and I mean, that's an important point because coaching isn't about sharing your experience anyway, right? It's about helping someone discover their own experience. And, I appreciate that sales may for sure requires a lot of strategy and skill. Um, but the salesperson is representing something, a product, a service, something. Whereas the coach is actually dealing with and connecting to people in a way that is a responsibility and a liability. Just as a therapist is responsible for the way that they interact with a
Yes.
client, right? A coach has to take that responsibility. That do no harm principle, I believe, has to be applied to coaching. And
Yes.
when it's not regulated, it's hard for a consumer to have recourse when it does go bad, right? So this idea of regulation, and I know that there's a lot of great coaches out there who are not necessarily certified, but I think it's time, just as psychology evolved and the College of Psychologists came
Yep.
about and the Order of Psychology came about. I think it's time for coaching to get there, to elevate the status of our profession. And just as you said, like you did learn something. It's not like you came in and said, "Yeah, check, 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 been doing that," and this is exactly what I thought coming in. Hopefully, anyway, there was a bit of a shift. Hopefully, there was some awareness created. Hopefully, there was evidence and research applied and empirical evidence to what it is, the strategies that you're using. Like I
Yeah.
think there's we have for sure we have a lot of knowledge. And actually, I find that coaching, when you come to the program, it's just a 2 millimeter shift. It's creating awareness around the things that you already know that you just haven't really thought of in that way. It's a perspective, right? It's not like we're teaching anything super brand new, although like there's different ways of being with people. But this shift is an important one when you think about the responsibility a coach has to a
Yes.
client. Yeah.
Absolutely. And being a doctor of the mind, you could call it psychology or whatever, but comes with a very real responsibility. And it can be dangerous, but it can also be wonderful. And
Mhm.
providing we have the right foundation, the right objectives, and the right tools to do the job, we can have a marvelous impact on people. Do you mind if I just share one other thing? Because
Yeah, of
I'm
course.
conscious of the time for us here. Is
Yeah, yeah,
I do want to share that the book that I just launched. So it's called Jump, Splash, Swim,
yeah. Mhm.
and it's about onboarding incoming leaders. I wrote it in a fable fashion. So it's actually a story, because I find that books that I read in leadership or in any functional area that includes a story, I tend to, it sticks a bit better. So I've written a story about a lady who joins a company as the vice president of sales, and the company have been having problems keeping a VP of sales. And it's her first 3 months, and
Mm.
she's coached through the process. And
Oh,
of course,
amazing.
she comes across all the same issues that many of us uncover when we join a new company. And will she stay? Will she be able to be successful? So I've tried to create a story that is engaging while also informative. So jump, splash, swim. If everybody goes out and buys that, I'd be very happy.
And what made you choose that title?
Because it's an analogy, and I'm thinking of the swimming pool, of course, but
Hmm.
the analogy is we dive into a job, we splash around, and we take in a lot of water. And actually, some people drown. I was actually going to call it jump, splash, drown. But of course, what I'm trying to do is to help people to swim. And
Hmm.
so once we've jumped into this pool, we've splashed around, we've figured out, the temperature and the depth and all that kind of stuff. We can swim. That's the goal. So, and I thought that was a little bit more creative than leadership
Yeah,
onboarding.
yeah. It sounds a little bit like in the style of Marilee Adams. Her book. She tells it like a story as well. The
Okay. I don't know her. I'm a very big fan of Patrick Lencioni.
Oh yeah,
So I've read
yes,
read all his books, and so
yeah,
if you read this book, you probably see a lot of influence in the structure of the book.
yeah,
And there's many others. I think one from many years ago, Who Moved My Cheese? That was one.
yeah. I've read
Or
that
the
actually. That's so
monk
funny.
who sold his Ferrari is
Yeah,
another one. So there's lots
yeah.
of books where they've used a fable in order to describe it. And I think I was a coach of soccer, for community soccer, for many years. And the way that the kids learned a skill is by
Mm-hmm.
playing, not by me telling them what to do. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think this storytelling
Mm-hmm.
in the coaching uh, kind of connects with a person's desire to listen to stories. So
Yeah.
jump, splash, swim. I hope it's a good story for you.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, and people can find that on Amazon, I would guess.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for your time, David. It was really nice to hear your perspectives and to, obviously have you share your wisdom on leadership and coaching. And yeah, I just really appreciate this time with you.
Well, I thank you not just for this chat, but also for creating Coach Academy and creating the program that I took. And I know thousands of others have as well. So I appreciate the work that you've done. And it's very nice to connect with you today over this format.